Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We are now in the third lecture of Chapter 16, Endocrine. And we're going to continue looking at some of the glands of the body. Previously, we covered the pancreas. Today, we're going to be looking at the thyroid gland and the parathyroid glands. So, as always, let's go ahead and start with our not really attendance questions. These are going to be a little bit tricky if you're not fresh on your Bio 137. So let's see if we know the answers. First, what is an osteoblast? Next, what is an osteoclast? And third, what happens to the blood when there is an increase in osteoclast activity? Go ahead and pause the video, try to answer those questions, see how well you can remember some of this older material. Okay, hopefully you've done that. So let's see what the answers are. First, what is an osteoblast? Well, remember, B-L-A-S-T at the end of a word means to build or to make or to give birth to. So an osteoblast, those are the cells that build bone. They really convert cartilage into bone by laying down that mineral factor that's in bone, things like calcium and stuff like that. Next, what is an osteoclast? Remember, osteoclast, C-L-A-S-T, at the end of a word means to break down. I think C for crush. So an osteoclast, exactly the opposite of an osteoblast. Osteoclasts break bone down. And now, what happens to the blood when there's an increase in osteoclast activity? Well, if you're breaking bone down, all of the ingredients that bone was made from are going to be released. And when you think of bone, what is the first thing that you think of that it's made from? Calcium. So when osteoclast activity is increased, that calcium spills into the blood. So our blood calcium levels increase. Kind of related to that, when osteoblasts are active, they're pulling calcium out of the blood to build bone with. So when osteoblast activity is increased, blood calcium decreases. Those two cells are working against each other all the time, keeping that blood calcium level in check, right where it's supposed to be. So, both of those things, osteoblast and osteoclast, and how they affect calcium, they're going to come into play today. So if that wasn't there kind of on the tip of your tongue, you might want to go back and refresh Chapter 6 from Bio 137, at least the part about osteoblast, osteoclast, and calcium homeostasis. So like I said, today we're talking about the thyroid and the parathyroids. And the thyroid gland is really two glands in one. It's going to have two different types of cells that we're looking at that have really, really dramatically different activity. So it's best to just think of the thyroid gland as two separate glands in the same place. And what we're looking at here on the left, this is the throat area right inside the front of the neck. This area right here is called the thyroid cartilage, so this is the larynx area. And right below the larynx, the Adam's apple, that is where we find the thyroid. And the thyroid wraps around the trachea, the windpipe. And it's kind of shaped like a letter H, or a capital letter H. It's got two larger areas on each side called lobes. So we have the right lobe and the left lobe of the thyroid, and they're connected by this small little cross bridge right here called the isthmus of the thyroid gland. Now, if we were to turn this person around, or this piece of person around, and look at the back, we would see that the thyroid gland does not connect in the back. So it's kind of like it's hugging or squeezing the front part of the throat, but not the back part of the throat. Over here on the right, this is a microscopic view of the thyroid. And when we look at the thyroid, there are two kind of distinct areas. There are these large, kind of somewhat roundish structures that seem to be open in the middle. And then there's this tissue in between them. Now, these large, really obvious, somewhat round structures are called thyroid follicles, or just follicles. And to describe what's going on here, I like to tell students, imagine one of these follicles is a swimming pool. It's got the walls of the swimming pool, and then it's got the water that fills the swimming pool. Well, the walls of that swimming pool, the edge of the follicle, we see a layer of cells there. This layer of cells, it's simple cuboidal epithelium, and these cells are called follicular cells. And inside of the follicles, we find this gelatinous substance called colloid. So the edge surrounded by cells, follicular cells, the inside filled with a gelatinous liquid called colloid. Now, this is one part of the thyroid gland. The other part is, if we look in this tissue here, most of it kind of looks like a typical cell. It's just kind of purple stained, pink stained, really big, obvious nuclei. We can see some connective tissue here, probably got some collagen fibers in there. But right here, we see it looks like an open space, but it's not. It's a cell that did not take any stain. So it looks clear, but there's a nucleus inside of it. Same thing over here. We've got a cell that looks clear and has got a nucleus inside of it. Here's two more. Here's one over here on the other side. Well, these cells are called parafollicular cells, or we might also sometimes see them called C cells. And the C is for clear because in a microscope, they appear clear. They don't take on stain. That's the other part of the thyroid gland. So we've got the thyroid follicles, and particularly the follicular cells around the edge. Those follicular cells produce a hormone, actually two hormones, called thyroid hormone. I said two hormones because there's something called T3 and another one called T4, and together they make up thyroid hormone. Now down here, the parafollicular cells, they make a hormone called calcitonin. So two separate glands in one location. The follicular cells make T3, T4, thyroid hormone. When they make it, it is stored here in the colloid inside the follicles. Parafollicular cells make calcitonin. So we are going to first talk about T3, T4, thyroid hormone, and then we are going to talk about calcitonin. So here is, again, I've filled it out for you, but there is more to it. So make sure that you don't just leave it as is. Make a little bit of note of your own. Thyroid hormone is an amine iodine. So that means that it's amino acid based, but it has iodine attached to it. And that's actually what the 3 and the 4 mean. Here, if it's T3, it's going to be an amino acid-based hormone that's got 1, 2, 3 iodines attached to it. It does not look like that. That's just me showing you that it's got 3 iodines attached to it. T4 would be the same amino acid-based hormone, except it's got 4 iodines attached to it. So the T3 tells us how many iodines, the T4 tells us how many iodines. T3 is called something along the lines of triiodothyronine, and T4 is actually called thyroxine. Okay, so even though they are different, once we get to the target cells, most of the T4 is converted to T3. Most of the hormone that's made is T4, but that T4 is converted to T3 at the target cell. How do we convert it? We just cut one of those iodines off. So don't worry about the difference between T3, T4. Together, we are just going to call them thyroid hormone. Just keep in your head that there are 2 different hormones there. So we're going to talk about the stimulus. We're going to talk about the inhibition. We're going to talk about the function, the secretion. But what I want you to think right now is we are going to go through the remainder of our glands, but we're going to come back to all of them. We covered pancreas early because it kind of does its own thing. But the remainder of the glands that we're going to talk about, we're going to go through them briefly, but then we are going to come back at the end and go over them again when we get to the pituitary gland. And that will make sense when we get to the pituitary gland. You'll understand why we're doing it that way and why we're not covering it in the order that the book presents it. So the stimulus for thyroid hormone is something called TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. Sometimes it's also called thyrotropin. TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, is thyrotropin. They're the same thing, just 2 different names. So when TSH is released, it travels to the thyroid gland, and the thyroid gland responds by releasing T3 and T4 thyroid hormone. It is inhibited by, so we stop releasing it when there is a lack of TSH. When TSH levels drop, we stop releasing thyroid hormone, T3 and T4. So it's released by TSH. It stops being released by a lack of TSH. But what does it do? What's the function of thyroid hormone? Well, if you look in your book, there is practically an entire page devoted to thyroid hormone. But we are going to kind of lump it all together in just a few basic categories because it does something different at every tissue in the body, but it falls into one of these categories. And it really all comes down to it causes transcription of proteins. It tells your cells to make proteins. And the result is either an increased metabolic rate, so your cells become more metabolically active. And when your cells are more metabolically active, it causes them to produce heat. If they're being active, heat is a byproduct. And when your body is metabolically active and produces heat, that's called the calorogenic effect. The calorogenic effect. Another thing that thyroid hormone is responsible for is development and growth. So in babies, in infants, in young adults, the thyroid is causing that growth. It's causing development. And the third thing is blood pressure regulation. So I say remember thyroxine from the BP unit, but that was because we used to do this chapter last. So I will instead say remember thyroxine when we get to the BP unit, blood pressure. When we get to the heart and the blood vessels, and we're talking about blood pressure, we will talk a lot about thyroxine because thyroxine regulates blood pressure. So those are the functions. There's a lot of functions, but we can kind of categorize them as increased metabolic rate, growth and development, blood pressure regulation. So what if we have too much thyroid hormone? Or what if we don't have enough thyroid hormone? Let's talk about hypersecretion and hyposecretion. Hypersecretion is generally just called hyperthyroidism, but there are different types of hyperthyroidism. Hyposecretion is generally called hypothyroidism, but there are different types of hypothyroidism. So we're just going to talk about a couple of types. First, hypersecretion, there is something called Graves' disease. And Graves' disease is an autoimmune disorder. Remember, autoimmune disorders, there is something wrong with a part of your body that's causing your immune system to think a part of your body is out of place. Your immune system becomes confused. Your immune system starts attacking some part of your body that's supposed to be there because it thinks that it's not. Well, in the case of Graves' disease, it's actually a specific antibody. So there is an antibody that's present that very, very closely resembles thyroid stimulating hormone. Think about how proteins work. Go back to Bio 137. How do proteins work? By shape. A protein has a very specific shape that allows it to do a very specific job. Well, if there is a protein that's shaped very, very similar to another protein, what's it going to do? It's going to behave like that protein. So in Graves' disease, the autoimmune disease, we have a protein, an antibody, that is misshapen. And it is misshapen so that it resembles TSH. So it does the same thing that TSH does. What does TSH do? It stimulates the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone. Causes increased metabolism. Causes tachycardia, which is increased heart rate. Causes nervousness. Weight loss, because if you're very metabolically active, you're burning a lot of calories, you're losing weight. Causes something called exophthalmos, which is bulging eyes. So another thing to think about here is goiter. So goiter is this right here. Goiter is a very swollen area on the neck. It's the thyroid itself starting to swell up. And when you have a goiter, the goiter is because of overstimulation of the thyroid follicles. When we stimulate the thyroid follicles too much, they start to swell. We get goiter. So how do you get rid of goiter? Well, by removing the thyroid gland entirely, or by giving the person radioactive iodine. So since we said T3 and T4 is because of the iodine, that's how many iodines there are, that means we need iodine to build thyroid hormone. If you inject or give tablets of iodine that is radioactive, that radioactive iodine is going to be used to build thyroid hormone. It's going to be placed into the colloid. What happens there? Well, since it's radioactive, it starts to destroy the thyroid follicles, which then fixes the goiter. Now, let's kind of take a sidetrack for a moment. Goiter, well, let's come back to this in just a moment. Let me talk about hyposecretion since we're already on the case of disorders. Let's talk about hyposecretion, not enough thyroid hormone. So in the case of hypothyroidism, we can get something called myxedema, which means mucus swelling, because you start to have mucus building up in the body. You start to get very swollen looking. But in the case of hypothyroidism, you can also get goiter. And this will make more sense when we get to the pituitary later, but let's go ahead and talk about why this happens. When there is low levels of thyroid hormone, what's going to happen? We need to raise thyroid hormone. How do you do that? The pituitary gland sends TSH. That should cause the thyroid gland to release T3, T4. But what if the thyroid gland doesn't have the ability to make T3, T4? What if it's either got something wrong with the thyroid gland itself, or what if the person is iodine deficient? What if they don't have enough iodine in their diet? Whatever the reason, if the thyroid gland cannot make T3, T4 thyroid hormone, well, the pituitary gland is going to keep releasing TSH and keep releasing TSH and keep releasing TSH. We are overstimulating the thyroid gland. What happens if you overstimulate the thyroid gland? You get a goiter. It doesn't matter why you're overstimulating the thyroid gland, and it doesn't matter if the thyroid gland is releasing T3, T4. If you are overstimulating it, it is going to start to swell and cause a goiter. So you could have a goiter from hypersecretion, as in the case of Graves' disease, or hyposecretion. Either way. So let's go back to what I was going to say just a moment ago. What if you didn't have enough iodine in your diet? You would become hypothyroid. So if you are hypothyroid, you can get a goiter. And that used to be the case. Back in the early 1900s, people regularly would get goiters. They still do now and then, but it's not as common, especially in the United States. It's more common outside the United States. But you're hypothyroid because you are, in this case, low in iodine. You get a goiter. Well, replace the iodine, give supplemental iodine, and that will fix that. That will prevent goiter. That will treat goiter. But how do you ensure that everyone's got enough iodine so that you don't have a goiter epidemic? Well, what's something that everybody eats, at least in the United States, eats way too much of, really? Salt. And if you've ever noticed, when you go to the grocery store and you buy salt, what does it say? Iodized salt. Iodized means that they have added iodine to it. If you have ever wondered why you go to buy salt and it's got iodine added to it, that is because they wanted to make sure that goiters were not as prominent as they used to be. So iodized salt is there to prevent goiter. Okay, now moving on to the other aspect of the thyroid gland. We said those parafollicular cells, or the C cells, the clear cells. Now we're going to be moving away from everything that we just talked about with the follicles. Now we're going to be talking about calcium homeostasis. And if you had me for Bio 137, I hope you remember seeing this same slide back in the bone chapter. All I did was copy and paste this into this chapter. We are talking about calcium homeostasis, and we are first going to talk about the top part. This is what the thyroid gland does. So calcitonin is a peptide, so it's amino acid based. It's a few amino acids stuck together. It's from the C cells, those clear cells between the follicles. Its stimulus is, there we see rising blood calcium. Its stimulus is an increase in blood calcium. It is inhibited by a drop in blood calcium. And its function is to lower blood calcium and lower blood phosphate by moving it into the bone. So let's go back over here and look. When blood calcium levels rise, the thyroid gland, but more specifically, the C cells or the parafollicular cells, increase calcitonin. So what does calcitonin do? It stimulates the osteoblasts and it inhibits the osteoclasts. If you stimulate osteoblasts, they're going to start building bone. And when you build bone, you need the ingredients for bone. Calcium and phosphate that were in the blood are taken out of the blood and used to build bone. So blood calcium and blood phosphate drop. Since osteoclasts are the cells that break bone down, we don't want them functioning. So calcitonin slows down the osteoclasts. It decreases their activity. Now, let's actually stay on that topic, but we're going to move to another gland. We're going to talk about something called the parathyroid glands. We are now looking at the back of the neck. So down here, this is the trachea, the windpipe that we saw earlier. Here at the back, remember, is the esophagus. This light-colored thing right here, this is the back of the thyroid. Remember I said it doesn't meet in the back? Well, on the back of the thyroid, there are these little nodules. There could be anywhere from 4 to 8 of them, depending on the person. Here we see 4 of them. These are called the parathyroid glands. Para means around or near, and that's because they are around the thyroid gland. So the parathyroid glands, they're kind of the opposite of the parafollicular cells or the C cells. Now we're going to look at the bottom half of this and see what happens when calcium levels fall. So parathyroid glands release parathyroid hormone. Easy enough to remember. Parathyroid hormone, or PTH. Parathyroid hormone is a protein. It's the most important hormone controlling blood calcium. Even though we went into quite a bit of depth with calcitonin, calcitonin at normal levels, when someone has normal levels of calcium, it's not very active. It doesn't play much of a role. Parathyroid glands are the ones that really play a big role in blood calcium. So its stimulus is a decrease in blood calcium, and its inhibition is an increase in blood calcium. So the opposite of calcitonin. Here's where it might get a little bit tricky. Its function is to raise blood calcium levels, but at the same time, it's going to lower blood phosphate levels. So that might be a little tricky. How do we do that? Because, as we just saw, blood calcium and blood phosphate tend to go in the same direction. Remember, calcitonin lowered both blood calcium and blood phosphate. But parathyroid hormone raises blood calcium, but it also lowers blood phosphate. So let's see how that happens. First, at the bones. Parathyroid hormone increases osteoclast activity and inhibits osteoblast activity, the opposite of calcitonin. We're going to start breaking bone down. And when we break bone down, calcium and phosphate are going to spill into the blood. So here's what happens. Blood calcium levels rise, blood phosphate levels rise. Both of them rise, but the blood phosphate levels rising is temporary. When we get to the kidneys, we're going to talk about this again, but let's see why that is. Another function of parathyroid hormone is to secrete phosphate from the blood. We're taking phosphate out of the blood and putting it into the kidneys so that we can urinate it out. So parathyroid hormone raises blood calcium, but it temporarily raises blood phosphate. Long term, it's going to lower blood phosphate because we're going to urinate it out. Another thing that parathyroid hormone does at the kidneys is it increases calcium reabsorption. It makes sure that not as much calcium is leaving in the urine. It's taking it back from the kidneys and putting it back into our blood. So it raises blood calcium, it temporarily raises blood phosphate, but long term it lowers blood phosphate. Another thing that parathyroid hormone does at the kidneys is think back to Bio 137 again. What happens when you are in the sun and sunlight, ultraviolet radiation hits your skin? Well, we talked about how it causes radiation damage to your DNA, but we said that it did something else that was beneficial. It took the cholesterol in your skin and turned it into an inactive form of vitamin D. Well, vitamin D in its inactive state is now circulating in the blood. It gets to the kidneys, and the parathyroid hormone tells your kidneys to activate the vitamin D. Well, once that vitamin D is active, what's the importance? The interesting thing about vitamin D is that it's required by our small intestines to absorb calcium from the food that we eat and the stuff that we drink. If you were to eat a meal high in vitamin D, or you drink some milk that's high in vitamin D, that's required so that you can absorb the calcium from the food. Let's say you sit down and you drink a gallon, well, not a gallon, a big glass of milk. But let's say you're vitamin D deficient. You don't have enough vitamin D in your body. What's going to happen? That calcium in the milk is going to pass straight through you. You're not going to absorb it. If you have plenty of vitamin D, you are going to absorb the calcium from that milk. But when you go to the store and you buy milk, you've probably noticed that it says something like vitamin D fortified. The reason that is, the people who are selling the milk, they don't know if you have enough vitamin D. They want to make sure that you have vitamin D so that you can absorb the calcium and benefit from it. That's why vitamin D is included in your milk. All right, so that's the end of today's lecture. We've still got a couple more lectures in the endocrine system. Next up, we will be talking about the adrenal glands, which is going to be a pretty big lecture. So be ready for that, and I will talk to you next time.